The stadium buzzed with anticipation. Thousands of people had gathered, draped in red, white, and blue, awaiting the kickoff of one of the biggest football games of the year. Families held their hands over their hearts. Veterans stood tall with solemn pride, and children fidgeted, waiting for the game to begin. Yet, at this moment, all eyes were on the center of the field, where a single figure stood, a teenage girl, microphone in hand, ready to sing the national anthem. Her name was Jasmine Carter, a 16-year-old high school student with a voice that could move mountains. For her, this performance was more than just another opportunity to sing. It was a defining moment, one that she had dreamed about her entire life. But as she took a deep breath, preparing to let her voice soar, she couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Jasmine had been chosen for this honor after winning a local talent competition, but not everyone was happy about it. The backlash had started almost immediately after the announcement. Social media comments ranged from subtle doubts to outright racism. Why is she singing the anthem? Don't they have someone more appropriate? One comment read. Not the right image for our national song. Another sneered. Others were even worse, filled with vitriol and hate, questioning her right to stand in this moment at all. It wasn't just the online world. Even in the crowd, as Jasmine stood under the bright lights, she could feel the unspoken tension. A few faces were twisted in skepticism, arms crossed tightly over jerseys and jackets. Some had murmured their discontent when her name was announced over the speakers. A middle-aged man in the front row shook his head, leaning over to whisper something to his wife. A group of teenagers snickered from the stands, nudging each other as if waiting for her to fail. Jasmine knew the history behind these reactions. Black performers had long faced scrutiny when stepping into spaces of national pride. From criticism of black athletes kneeling during the anthem to the deep-seated biases in American patriotism, her presence here was, to some, an unwelcome statement. But she wasn't here to make a political point. She was here to do what she loved, to sing. Still, she couldn't shake the doubts creeping into her mind. What if she messed up? What if their whispers turned into laughter? What if the headlines the next day weren't about her talent, but about her ruining the anthem? She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the words of her grandmother. Your voice is your power, Jasmine. Let them hear it. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the singing of the national anthem, performed by Jasmine Carter. A hush fell over the stadium. Jasmine took one final deep breath and lifted the microphone to her lips. The first note rang out, strong and clear. But what happened next, no one expected. The first few words of the Star-Spangled Banner left Jasmine's lips, cutting through the silence like a knife. Her voice was rich, soulful, and unwavering, a sound that seemed to demand attention. It didn't take long for those who had doubted her to realize something remarkable was happening. Yet, despite the purity of her performance, not everyone was willing to let go of their preconceived notions. From the very first note, there were subtle reactions in the crowd, narrowed eyes, crossed arms, a few whispered remarks exchanged between skeptics. Some people didn't even bother whispering. They had to go and make this political, muttered a man in a navy blue jacket, shaking his head. This is why we can't just enjoy the game anymore. Another added under his breath, his arms crossed tightly. A few others in the stands exchanged skeptical looks, their expressions hardening as if searching for something. Some small mistake, some imperfection that would validate their beliefs. But Jasmine didn't falter. She kept singing, each note rising in intensity, each word carrying with it the depth of the moment. Backstage, Jasmine's mother, Angela Carter, watched anxiously. She had seen the comments online before the performance. She knew how cruel the world could be. Jasmine had always been strong, but Angela worried. Would this moment break her? Would she see the ugliness of the world before she even had the chance to finish her song? Angela wasn't the only one watching with concern. Seated in the VIP section was Coach Bill Henderson, a retired Marine and a longtime supporter of veterans in sports. He had been attending games for years, always standing tall and firm when the anthem played. But even he had reservations when he first saw Jasmine take the field. I just don't know if this is the right choice, he had said earlier to a colleague. It wasn't that he doubted her talent. He had never heard her sing before. But something in him had resisted the idea, an ingrained instinct that this moment, this sacred tradition, should be handled a certain way, by a certain kind of person. As the song continued, a tension settled over the stadium. There was an unspoken standoff between those who were letting themselves be moved by Jasmine's voice and those who refused to. Then, the first crack in the wall of doubt appeared. An older woman in the front row, a veteran's widow wearing a faded military pin, wiped a tear from her eye. She had been one of the skeptical ones, one of the people who had crossed her arms at the beginning. But something about the way Jasmine sang, the sheer emotion in her voice, broke through her defenses. One by one, more people in the crowd started to lean in, their expressions shifting. Some had come expecting controversy. Instead, they were witnessing something undeniable, raw talent, pure and simple. But not everyone was willing to let go of their prejudices so easily. Halfway through the anthem, a man near the back let out an exaggerated sigh and muttered, "This is ridiculous." His voice was loud enough that a few people turned to look at him, but he didn't care. He gestured toward the field dismissively. They should have picked someone who actually respects this country. A younger woman beside him frowned. "Are you even listening?" she asked. "I don't need to listen," he scoffed. "I know exactly how this goes. First, they put her up there. Next thing you know, we're talking about oppression instead of football. This is supposed to be about unity." But wasn't that exactly what was happening? In the past, the anthem had been a battleground for political debates, from athletes kneeling in protest to debates over patriotism. Yet, at this moment, it wasn't about any of that. It was about a young girl, standing alone on a field, pouring her heart into a song that meant something to her. It was about the power of music to transcend division, if only people were willing to listen. Jasmine hit the high note, her voice soaring above the crowd, filling every corner of the stadium. The moment was electric. For the first time, even her harshest critics were struggling to hold on to their skepticism. They had been waiting for her to fail. But she wasn't failing. She was shining, and that was something they couldn't ignore. The anthem was nearing its end, and something incredible was beginning to happen. But the true turning point was still to come. Jasmine's voice rang out, filling the massive stadium with a sound so powerful it was almost impossible to deny. The high notes carried an energy that sent shivers down spines, an undeniable force of raw talent and emotion. Then, something unexpected happened. A man in the middle of the crowd, one of the skeptics who had initially crossed his arms, lowered them. His face, once etched with doubt, now showed something else, realization. He had come in with his own biases, ready to dismiss this girl before she had even opened her mouth. But what he was hearing now, he couldn't deny it. Jasmine wasn't just singing the anthem. She was owning it. Her voice wasn't just strong, it was breathtaking. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Somewhere in the stadium, a veteran in a worn-out Marine Corps cap stood a little taller, his skepticism melting away. A mother holding her child pulled her phone out to record. Even the teenagers who had snickered earlier had gone silent, their faces shifting from amusement to awe. One by one, people who had been waiting to disapprove began to let themselves feel what was happening. But not everyone. Near the back, a man still stood stiffly, arms locked over his chest. His name was Robert Langley, a longtime fan who had been coming to games for over a decade. He had always been vocal about his opinions, and tonight was no different. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, barely able to hear himself over the soaring notes. His friend, Mike Sanders, glanced at him. "What's ridiculous?" "All of this." Robert gestured toward the field. "It's a stunt. She's up there because they're trying to prove some kind of point." Mike frowned. "What point?" "She's just singing the anthem." Robert scoffed. "Come on, Mike. This is about politics, about shoving an agenda in our faces. It's always something these days." Mike didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes back to the field, watching Jasmine. And then, something happened that neither of them expected. The final verse of the anthem began, and Jasmine sang it like it was the only song in the world. "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave?" Her voice swelled, rising in emotion and power. And in that moment, something shifted. Robert, still with his arms crossed, felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest, something that almost made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to feeling moved by something he had already decided he didn't want to like. But it was undeniable. People around him had started to react. A man behind him, a fellow season ticket holder, was nodding, a small smile creeping onto his face. A young woman near the front had her hands clasped together, eyes glistening. Mike, still watching, turned back to his friend. "Just listen," he said quietly. "Forget everything else. Just listen to her." Robert wanted to resist. He wanted to hold on to his belief that this was all wrong. But as Jasmine held the final note, the purest, most stunning sound filled the stadium. A few seconds of silence followed, an unspoken pause as if the entire crowd had collectively forgotten how to react. Then, the first clap rang out. It was hesitant, coming from the older veteran in the front row, the one who had wiped a tear from her eye earlier. A second clap followed, then another, and suddenly, the crowd erupted into applause. Not polite applause, not obligatory claps. A roaring, deafening standing ovation. People leaped to their feet. Cheers echoed through the stadium. The same people who had doubted her, who had whispered their skepticism, were now standing with hands cupped around their mouths, shouting their approval. Even those who had remained silent, who had resisted the moment, found themselves caught up in it. Robert's arms slowly fell to his sides. He didn't clap. Not yet. But something in his face had changed. He had spent the last few minutes trying to find a reason to dislike what was happening, and he had found none. On the field, Jasmine stood, breathless, taking it all in. She had done it. And as the cheers rained down around her, she knew this moment was bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about singing. This was about proving something. And she had. But the true impact of this moment, that was yet to be seen. The applause didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, swelling into something almost uncontainable. Jasmine had expected a reaction, some cheers, maybe polite clapping, but this was overwhelming. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as she stood there, microphone still in hand, staring out at the sea of people on their feet. Veterans, families, diehard football fans, people who had been ready to doubt her, were now celebrating her. But among the noise, Jasmine also saw something else. There were still some people who weren't clapping. A few sat stubbornly, arms crossed, refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. Some had expressions of indifference, others of discomfort, as if clapping would mean admitting they had been wrong. And then there were those like Robert. He still wasn't clapping, but he also wasn't sitting. He stood there, motionless, watching. Something was shifting inside him, but he wasn't quite ready to name it. As Jasmine stepped away from the microphone, the event organizers rushed forward, shaking her hand, patting her on the back. A sports commentator on the sidelines spoke into his mic, his voice animated. "That was something special, folks. Jasmine Carter just delivered one of the most powerful renditions of the national anthem we've ever heard." The reaction extended beyond the stadium. Phones had been recording the performance from all angles, and within minutes, social media was ablaze. Videos of Jasmine's anthem were already being shared at an alarming rate, captions filled with words like chills, history-making, and unbelievable talent. But the shift wasn't just online. In the VIP section, Coach Bill Henderson, the retired Marine who had questioned Jasmine's presence on that field, found himself rubbing his chin, deep in thought. He had spent years standing for the anthem, honoring his fellow veterans. But tonight, something had been different. He turned to the man sitting beside him, a fellow veteran. "That girl," he started, then paused. The man nodded. "Yeah, that was something else." Coach Henderson had been ready to criticize, ready to say she wasn't the right choice. Now, he realized he had been holding on to an idea of what the anthem should be, and Jasmine had just shattered that idea, proving that it could be something even greater. Meanwhile, Robert found himself doing something he hadn't done in a long time. He was questioning himself. He had been so sure, so certain, that this moment was meant to be controversial, that people like Jasmine were just trying to make statements, push agendas. But she hadn't done that. She had just sung, and it had been beautiful. Robert wasn't ready to admit it out loud, but deep down, something inside him had shifted. Later that night, when he got home, he scrolled through his phone and saw a clip of the performance. He tapped on it, watching Jasmine's face as she poured her heart into the song. For the first time, alone in his living room, he allowed himself to feel what he had been resisting. Pride. Not anger. Not frustration. Not division. Just pure, undeniable pride. And that was the moment he knew, whether he liked it or not, he had been wrong. Jasmine Carter hadn't just sung the anthem. She had changed it. And in doing so, she had changed the people who had been willing to listen. The morning after the game, Jasmine woke up to something she never expected. Her phone was buzzing nonstop, Hundreds, no, thousands of notifications flooding in. Messages from strangers, celebrities, journalists. Social media was ablaze with her name. Hashtag Jasmine Carter Anthem was trending at #1. News stations replayed the performance with headlines like, Newspaper, A Star is Born. Jasmine Carter's anthem stuns the nation. Newspaper, She silenced the haters and won over America. Newspaper, The national anthem like you've never heard before. Her inbox was filled with interview requests. Good Morning America. CNN. Even sports legends and famous musicians were praising her. But the most unexpected messages were the personal ones. A retired Marine sent her an email. I've heard the anthem played 1,000 times, but last night, I truly felt it for the first time. Thank you for reminding me what it stands for. A father messaged her on Instagram. My daughter saw you sing last night. She told me, Daddy, I want to be like her. Thank you for showing her that she can. Even Coach Henderson, who had once doubted her, reached out. He left a voicemail. Jasmine, I've been going to these games for a long time. I've seen a lot of anthems. But yours was something special. You've got a fan in me. But perhaps the most surprising message came from Robert. The same Robert who had stood with his arms crossed, unwilling to applaud. It wasn't much, just a simple comment under one of the viral videos. I judged too soon. I was wrong. She earned that moment. For someone like him, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Jasmine's performance didn't just last for a night. It became a defining moment. She was invited to sing at major events across the country. The video of her anthem was played in schools as an example of how music can unite people. Even those who had doubted her in the beginning had to admit she had made history. And it wasn't just about her voice. It was about how she had changed minds, how she had broken barriers, how she had proved that talent has no boundaries. Jasmine had walked onto that field expecting resistance. She had walked off having won over a nation. And as she looked ahead, she knew this was just the beginning. She hadn't just sung the national anthem. She had rewritten the story of what it could mean.